All right, we got a lot of new folks, and that's great because we've got a really all-star panel today of people who've been really deep in the Bitcoin development for many years. But first, a little bit about me. My name's Pete Rizzo. I am not a developer, as these guys can attest. I'm editor at Bitcoin Magazine, editor-at-large at the Kraken Cryptocurrency Exchange, and you know me as someone who writes really long stories about the history of Bitcoin and Bitcoin development. So wanted to lead with a little bit of why I do that and why that is an interesting thing to me. I think the question of Bitcoin development is the really question of what is Bitcoin, right? What should it be? And how are we building a global money system for the whole world? And I'll introduce the panelists now who are going to talk a little bit about that. To my left, applied cryptographer Peter Todd, Mr. Eric Lombrozo.
To your right,
and then finally, we've got Brian Bishop over here, and I will sit down and we will begin the panel. All right, guys. Obviously, we've got some people here who are new. They want to understand Bitcoin. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your personal journeys. When did you get involved in Bitcoin, and then did you get it right away? Was there a point where you found it and you understood Bitcoin?
I mean, you can trace back my involvement in Bitcoin all the way back to when I was 16 in high school. And, I was quite interested in freedom of speech, et cetera, and I realized pretty quickly that, there's these great tools coming down at the time for publishing data. But how do you build political movement without money? Even if you go down to like a protest by some union, like all those signs cost money. And I figured out pretty quickly we needed decentralized cryptocurrency to ensure that people could go move money around. And that kind of was my genesis. And funny enough, went out on a mailing list with Adam Back and Hal Finney talking about stuff that didn't actually turn into Bitcoin because we didn't have a clue how to do it, but we tried.
Eric, maybe you can pick up there and talk a little bit about your journey. It sounds like Peter, he was born, he understood cryptocurrency, he was looking for it his whole life. Is that your story as well?
No, not at all. I've got into Bitcoin more from a development standpoint just to write open source software. It was the first open source project that I really participated in, and I was interested in getting back into software development after a couple of years hiatus from that. And I really wasn't looking at the monetary side at all. And I started to contribute, and I spent all these months just writing these really intricate, pull requests, basically trying to get all these features added into Bitcoin. And I just dedicated so much time and effort and made it so beautiful. And then I realized that basically none of it was ever going to make it into Bitcoin at all. So that's when I realized that changing Bitcoin is very, very hard. And it was really, really an eye-opener. I realized that from a technical perspective, I was more used to just being able to add new features to products in the past, and this was a case where really the key value proposition was something entirely different. And that's when I really started to look at the monetary side, and I got sucked into the rabbit hole, and then, the rest is history.
Brian, why don't you take that? Did you get Bitcoin? You understood it immediately, or did it take time?
Yeah, I found Bitcoin through the email that was originally sent announcing Bitcoin. And that was in January 2009.
Wow.
And I read it and I said, this is a piece of crap. And the reason I said that was because at the time when you clicked a link in the email, you went to a website where you could download Bitcoin, the software, not the currency. And it only ran on Microsoft Windows. And I was saying, well, you can't run a financial revolution that only targets Microsoft Windows. Well, one, I was incorrect. And two, they fixed that. So that was helpful. It wasn't until about 2013 that I really looked into things, and ultimately what got me hooked was the Bitcoin developers. I talked with them, I met them, and I saw what they were working on and what they were doing, who they were, and I realized these are my people. And that's actually what convinced me about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I've always felt better hearing those stories and hearing about sometimes how long it took and a bit of those struggles. But you guys also worked on some other projects, right? It wasn't like you found Bitcoin and I'm only going to work on Bitcoin. There were parts on your journey where I know some of you guys contributed to other cryptocurrency projects. What was it that really convinced you that it was Bitcoin and that was the thing that you wanted to work on? Peter?
Well, when I of course, in high school I was interested in the idea, but then once Bitcoin finally came around, I actually happened to be working as an analog electronics designer at a startup, and I was also trying to do a physics degree at the same time, so I was more than a little busy, but, my initial impression of Bitcoin, this was sort of very beginning as the sort of the scaling wars, and I was kind of looking at things like the famous Bitcoin wiki pages by Mike Hearn making crazy claims about how, we could just run it all on supercomputers basically, and you'd have a couple nodes run by very wealthy hobbyists. And I read this, and initially kind of seemed like, oh yeah, maybe this could work. And then I kind of started thinking more and more, well, how do I attack this? Because Bitcoin's ultimate security software.
Did you try to attack Bitcoin?
Well, I went through I don't have the ability, I didn't have any mining, so I couldn't do an attack, but I could think through how would an attack look, and I quickly realized, we had to have a system where the nodes themselves could be decentralized, where everyone, could participate. And I think that's actually prior to Bitcoin kind of splitting off into other currencies. So I was already, at least in the cryptocurrency side, already kind of committed to Bitcoin at that point, and I was already arguing, well, Bitcoin should pursue the path it has pursued up till this date mostly.
Eric, maybe you could pick up that question. I know you tinkered around with other ideas, natural for technologists. What was it that convinced you that Bitcoin, of all the cryptocurrencies, was the thing that was most worth your time and the most worthwhile project out there?
So like I said, initially I was really looking to expand, to extend Bitcoin by adding a whole bunch of new features, including a whole bunch of protocol changes that I thought would add a whole bunch of things from optimizations to being able to do things that you couldn't do before, to adding more smart contract capabilities, to all sorts of things. And so I did work on a few other projects. I was one of the earliest developers to work on Ethereum, for instance, because I was really excited about just trying out other stuff. Whether it worked or not, I didn't really care at the moment because I just wanted to experiment, and I kind of thought that something else might eventually overtake Bitcoin. I thought that Bitcoin was a prototype, and it was an interesting idea, but it could be done technically better. Also, the source code was not particularly the most elegantly written code. I thought that it could be written much better. It could be refactored completely and put into a much better form. All these things proved to be almost impossible to do the way that I thought. And I realized that there's a reason why Bitcoin needs to be difficult to change. As frustrating as it is for a technologist, that was actually one of its key features. And after working on Ethereum for a while, and Litecoin and Ripple and several other projects, it became quickly apparent to me after all that experience. I mean, it wasn't quick. It took me a while to figure this out. But once it came to me pretty quickly that none of these other things were going to ever be able to have the level of trust of the not only the network effect, but people kind of believing that the network had certain properties that you cannot replicate by just writing code. It was not just the code itself, it was also the way that the project started, the way the network was created, the economic incentives built into it, the distribution of the coins, a whole bunch of other factors that were critical. And only Bitcoin seemed to have all these factors in the right way to be long-term sustainable.
And Brian, so was it similar for you, or did you just get that email from Satoshi and that was it for you?
No, as I mentioned, one of the biggest items for me was the developers, and I met them and got to know them and really liked what they were doing and how they were going about doing it. But the second part that convinced me to work on and use Bitcoin was the software. So, if you really sit down and think about it, fiat paper money, if it didn't exist and there was like a new startup that came out on the block and said, hey, let's trade around green pieces of paper to represent value, everyone would call you completely crazy. And so, where I was mentally was like, all right, finance doesn't really make sense. Why is anyone doing this? And then I found Bitcoin and I was like, oh, this is software. This makes a lot of sense. This is exactly what we should be doing. Software is still eating the world, and Bitcoin is proving that.
Well, I think one of the other things that is fascinating too is that it wasn't that everyone immediately came to Bitcoin and had the same idea, right? I think as you were alluding to, Peter, there were people who were writing popular posts early on that are about things that now we've proven just that's inaccurate or not a way that we'd like to pursue development. So when was it clear to you guys that there were different opinions about what Bitcoin should be or how it should scale or how more people should use it? Could you tell a story that illustrates, what was that moment when you realized, hey, other people think different from me and like maybe we're going to fight about it?
Well, from the very beginning, there was only two things. One is the white paper from Satoshi, and then there was the Bitcoin source code. And between the two, the white paper is easier to read for most people, but the reality of Bitcoin is defined by the software. And for a long time, a big issue was that as more and more people got interested in Bitcoin, their ideas of what Bitcoin was kind of got away from them. For a long time, there was a narrative that Bitcoin was completely anonymous. For a long time, there was a narrative that Bitcoin transactions were completely free. They're not. There's a transaction fee. There's actually a transaction fee in the protocol, but because people can't read code in general, they didn't know that. And it's taken a long time for knowledge to be disseminated from developers so that people are aware of what is actually in Bitcoin.
Eric, what was your moment where you realized, hey, other people think differently than me about what Bitcoin is?
Well, in the very early days, there were just people brainstorming about everything, right? On the IRC chats and then in the mailing list, a lot of people just kind of thought up a lot of different ideas, and it's like, what if we try this? What if we try that? And sometimes the ideas were very interesting, but most of them proved to be pretty academic because in practice they would be either impossible to do or they just wouldn't work out, and they were just kind of interesting case studies at best. And so it just became clear that really there needs to be the process itself, the whole process for being able to modify Bitcoin was very, very difficult for people to really, it was really difficult for most people to really grasp. Even though it was very open, it was a very open process, a lot of people got really frustrated and turned off by the fact that it was just really, really difficult to make contributions. And a lot of animosity, I think, came from that because people were just really frustrated. And a lot of projects that forked off or other things that other projects that were created by people trying to make changes to Bitcoin initially that got frustrated in their efforts. So it was pretty clear that different people had different ideas of what it was going to be. And I just stepped back. I said, you know what? This is not up to me to decide what Bitcoin is. It just is going to be whatever it is. It's like a living organism, and you either adapt to it or it'll consume you. So everything that I've done since is just trying to figure out what's going to work, like basically what Bitcoin naturally is predisposed to do, and kind of just go along with it and not try to stray too far from something that's just not, it's not going to work.
I mean, I think I take a different view on that where, my realization that this big block vision of what Bitcoin could be is nonsense. That was, to me, the moment when I also had the light bulb come and saying, hang on, this is obviously going to be political. And it's fundamentally political, even within itself, because you have this block size debate, which is inherent to the protocol.
Well, that was about really how to change Bitcoin and scale it, right? For more people.
Like that was the moment for me, was like, all right, I want to get into this because this sounds really interesting. I kind of like interesting political fights, especially when they have a tech angle to them. And B, I realized, that would be the defining thing about Bitcoin. And I was completely right. I mean, that's, probably, that realization was probably about a year prior, or maybe 6 months prior to then me getting publicly involved in the very early block size debates when Gavin wanted to remove the block size limit. And his argument was, well, that would just self-regulate. And I had an argument as to why it wouldn't. And, my argument was mathematically pretty simple. It was a bit off. There's slightly better bounds on that. But the important thing is I realized this cannot work. This will be inherently centralized. You go this way, or you can build it in layers and create a system that's decentralized. And, an interesting question here is how much of the audience has used the Lightning Wallet, right?
I don't know. We should ask them. How many in the audience have used the Lightning Wallet? Good amount.
Well, it's no surprise. That's the only way you can use Bitcoin at scale that we currently have. And that was the political fight. And I think that's the peak of my involvement with Bitcoin development directly was that.
So you have these developers,
Peter, how were you so early with that video you made? Maybe you could describe, what inspired you to make such a polished video so early on? Was it 2012, 2013? Where did that come from?
Well, so you're thinking the block size video I had made? Well, that was like 2014. That was years after. But I mean, the big thing was I was at a startup, incredibly busy because I was trying to finish a degree while also working at a startup. So I didn't actually have much time to spend on Bitcoin. So if anything, I feel that my understanding of that scaling problem actually came a bit late compared to when I knew about Bitcoin. You know, I mean, I found out about Bitcoin from the white paper back in 2009, but I just didn't pay any attention to it because I was too busy.
So you got these developers, you got these businesses, we're all running this software. We all have these big ideas about Bitcoin, how to change it. I guess, Peter, sticking with you, is there a story that illustrates to you really just, how complex that process was? And it really maybe even just how bad it got to be involved in trying to do something to make Bitcoin better?
I mean, what I expected and how it turned out was actually quite different. And funny enough, I thought the big block side of things, I was expecting them to be much more competent than they were. Like, frankly, I was expecting them to be competent adversaries who understood how the tech worked very well and could come up with proposals that at least kind of made technological sense and so on. But that's not how it happened at all. Rather, it was like we were up against a ragtag team of big companies who wanted to, push changes to make their bad business plans work. Mm-hmm. And most of what really happened in terms of our side was more reacting by just pointing out how flawed all this was. It was a very strange debate. I mean, it's kind of like, you assume when you're up against, the world's economic system, you assume you're going to get the CIA on you and it'll be all black box stuff. And instead, I wind up in a lawsuit with Craig Wright of all people. Like, how do I wind up with adversaries that dumb?
Eric, maybe you want to take that again. Maybe illustrate what it was like for people to be involved in, as Peter is saying. There's all these people who have, maybe they have good intentions, but they're maybe trying to make unwise changes to Bitcoin.
Well, I mean, one thing that should be pointed out is that Satoshi never actually said how to change the protocol. He put together this white paper and this implementation. And at the beginning, he would change stuff and say, well, this is what the new thing is going to be. And if you have 10 nodes running, well, you can just upgrade them all. This process obviously didn't scale. And there was no recommendation, no specific process for how to change the protocol at all. And a lot of the discoveries in that kind of were serendipitous. The whole idea of hard forks and soft forks, for instance, and the way that the processes were developed for that, and trying to keep the network from breaking, from fragmenting or forking during these changes. It was just kind of a process of trial and error and discovery, and it was just really, we just tried a whole bunch of different things. For instance, and we also learned a lot from other projects. For instance, when the Ethereum DAO fork happened, that kind of illustrated a little bit of what might happen if there's a contentious hard fork. And that settled some of the issues. So a lot of the things were not just about what features people wanted. Some people really wanted Bitcoin to scale for payments, and a lot of the big blocks ideas came from that. But the process to be able to get to that was really, really complicated, and a lot of people, I think, just didn't really understand just how difficult that process was. And even till today, we don't really have a solid process for how to do that.
I mean, I got to push back a bit on that, saying, like, something a lot of people don't realize is Bitcoin used to have a version opcode, which is put the version of the software the node was running onto the stack. That is completely busted.
Horrible idea.
Technologically does not work. So I'd say, yes, Satoshi had some ideas about how you'd upgrade the protocol, but they're just totally busted. And I mean, what do you expect? As far as we know, Satoshi's human. So of course, Satoshi's going to make human mistakes.
Brian, you agree with that? Did you think Satoshi left an incomplete project? And I guess, how do you describe that?
Well, actually, Bitcoin was surprisingly complete from the beginning. There were missing pieces, but actually there was even more in the code that Satoshi had left, such as marketplaces and some DeFi stuff that never actually worked or were ever used. But essentially, Bitcoin has been a piece of software that is consistently run, and it has not experienced extended downtime. Ever. And that's actually really, really impressive for the quality of the software that it was in the beginning. It wasn't in a good place, but people are helping to get it cleaner all the time, of course.
I guess the other question I would ask is, what kept you guys going through the conflict, right? I remember this, one of the things I say about conferences today is there's a lot less grown man crying than there used to be during these days where there's a lot of conflict. So what kept you guys going and convinced that you were right about your vision, and what gave you the ability to just follow through with that?
Oh, I mean, there's an easy answer to that. I thought it was fun. I know my view on that's not shared by probably most developers, but that conflict is why I got into Bitcoin. I knew it would happen. And
Peter Todd, here to pick a fight.
Yeah, I thought this is going to be really interesting, and it was.
Eric, I guess, what kept you going, and I guess, to maybe tell people about what that was like.
Well, I mean, at the time, I really had nothing better to do in my life. So this was just the most interesting thing happening, and I figured that if I'm going to do it, I might as well just go all out, and I had nothing to lose. A lot of people came into the space, from other things where they had some successes in something, and they kind of felt that they had to, they had that clout, then they could just carry it over into Bitcoin. I really had nothing to lose at the time, or at least I felt that way. I felt that in the worst of cases, I'll just leave this and find some other project to work on, right? But there was no other project that even came close to being as interesting. And it became pretty clear once the whole block size thing started to happen, with people really kind of getting forming camps into this. It was very clear to me that if we didn't do something about this, I mean, if we didn't try to keep things together, Bitcoin was going to break. And I think that's the closest that Bitcoin has actually come to being destroyed till today. And it just, I mean, what else am I going to do in my life that's more interesting than trying to keep something alive that people are trying to kill, right? So, yeah.
Brian, was there a point where you were ever worried about Bitcoin? I mean, obviously, you guys don't think that if we made certain changes that maybe Bitcoin would be as successful as it was today.
No, but I would point out, though, that everyone loves to argue on the internet. That is their favorite pastime. And there was definitely a lot of arguing about Bitcoin. But from my perspective, I was looking at what I felt was the evidence, and I was looking at how it seemed to work. And there's a lot of wishful thinking about what Bitcoin can do or might be capable of doing, and then there's the cold hard facts. And unfortunately, we have to respect the facts. And that's what fueled me through the disagreement, I suppose.
Why do you guys think that it's important for people to understand the conflict or understand how you guys approach the question of what Bitcoin is and what it should be? Do you think that's important? Is that something you think about, Peter?
I think it's important to understand it because A, people are going to try to go change Bitcoin again. Mm-hmm. And B, there's always going to be alternatives to Bitcoin which have different trade-offs. I mean, a simple example is the Zcash implementation. That's a completely centralized thing which literally just stops working. I mean, the mobile coin, that goes even a step further where it is impossible to use mobile coin software that is not authorized by the core developers who created the Mobile Coin Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. It is digitally signed by them, and the nodes will not talk to each other unless they verify that digital signature. There is a whole set of trade-offs you could go through to, of course, PayPal, where they just control everything. But people need to understand this stuff because ultimately, regardless of what cryptocurrency or other asset you get, or even what you're building on, you need to know what you're getting. And it's such an important part of how these systems work and how vulnerable they are to attack.
Eric, maybe you want to take that. Why do you feel like it's important? And I guess maybe share a little bit about that.
About what?
This is why it's important for people to understand that there is a history of conflict about Bitcoin and its direction, and maybe we know a little bit more today than we used to, but maybe that's a process that we're still ongoing.
Well, I mean, it should be clear that, we're basically, this is war. Basically, there's a lot of interest at play here that, in very, very high stakes. And so conflict is just a part of that, and there's going to continue to be conflicts, and it's important for people to understand how conflicts were resolved in the past and what kind of precedent was set by that, so people understand in the future how they can handle conflicts in the future. We're in uncharted territory, so I doubt that there's going to be another conflict that's exactly the same as conflicts in the past. But we learn from each one, so it's important that we kind of keep that memory alive so that people know how to respond to these kinds of things.
Brian?
So what I recommend is be very careful about who you listen to about what Bitcoin is. How do they know what it is? Who are they? Where did their information come from? if you're not careful about this, you're going to be tricked into using software that steals your Bitcoin. You're going to be tricked into alternative protocols, and Bitcoin is a bearer asset. So if you lose it, it's gone. So just be really careful and try to respect the code.
Well, since you just said that, I think we should end it with just saying, what is Bitcoin then? And maybe you can tell the audience your version of that.
My definition of what Bitcoin is?
Yes, yeah.
In my opinion, Bitcoin is the code that is on in the Bitcoin Git repository that compiles into Bitcoin Core. To me, that is Bitcoin.
I have a slightly different opinion. I think that's a huge component, but I also think that the social layer is really important, and the culture that exists, and the idea that people should validate stuff. And if that goes away, it's really easy for Bitcoin to become subverted by some entity that keeps the same form. It looks similar to what Bitcoin was, but people change their culture, nobody validates anymore, and all of a sudden you're using the same kind of stuff, but now people can start to change the supply or do other kinds of things, right? And it's really important for people to understand that it's up to them to make sure that, not everyone needs to do it, but enough people need to do it that don't have, they are not going to collude in their interests for Bitcoin to remain secure. So, yeah.
Peter?
I think Brian's definition is totally busted because it goes the wrong way. It says, Bitcoin is this thing on this GitHub, et cetera, but that really kind of implies, well, GitHub could change it. And of course, and I know you know this, but of course that's not true. Bitcoin is ultimately what it is in all of our minds, and it ends up being a social consensus. It's a social consensus that's incredibly sticky because anyone could just go to github.org and get a copy that happens to validate what that social consensus is. But the first and foremost definition is the social consensus. Bitcoin is the fact we can have conferences like this with tens of thousands of people worldwide showing up at these things all the time who ultimately can send each other Bitcoin, and we'll say, yep, you sent me Bitcoin, I got your Bitcoin. That's really what Bitcoin is.
The development process in action, conflict, disagreement. Why don't we give these guys a round of applause? These guys have been really instrumental in the history of Bitcoin and done a lot for the space. This is going to be it for the stage. Thank you for coming to OG Dev Storytime. Quick plug, I mentioned I was editor-at-large at the Kraken Cryptocurrency Exchange. Also do open source development funding for them. So if you have a great idea, something you're looking to get off the ground, come find me, kraken.com/grants. And again, thanks for these guys.
Thank you.